About 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago now, just before the pandemic hit, actually, in fact, my family and I got the opportunity to go to the supposed happiest place on earth. Now, I'm the biggest fan of Disney, outside of my love for the movie Aladdin, as you may recall, and I also had great love and admiration for the movie The Lion King. Both of those are fantastic films. But by and large, I was a much bigger fan of the bunny than I was of the mouse. So the idea of going to Disney was not exactly overly enthusiastic for me. But I am a girl dad. And being a girl dad meant that I was subject to more princess movies than slapstick movies. And so like Thanos, Disney World was inevitable. But fortunately for me, I didn't have to pay for Disney. My mother had actually received a fairly good-sized inheritance that she wasn't really expecting to get, but she had gotten it. And she decided to take a good chunk of that to take our whole family to Disney free of charge. My father, they were still married at the time, my wife and I and our two kids, my brother and his wife and their two kids, the Bogues were going to Disney World. We were going to test that whole happiest place on earth thing. But we got an opportunity to go to this. And the only thing better than getting to take your children to Disney, and they were 7 at the time, so that was the perfect age to take them. The only thing better than taking your 7-year-old daughters to Disney for free. Mom had worked everything out. She worked with a travel agent who worked exclusively for Disney trips. Apparently that's a thing. But they got the flight, the resort reservation, the restaurant reservations for us, the meal plan, everything was planned out. The plan for us as a family was to just make sure that we were on time for the flight and have fun. That was the plan. But as we all know, sometimes in life, plans may not go according to plan. And for us, the entirety of our Disney plan was threatened to fall apart right as soon as we got at the airport. For 9 of us, it was totally fine. Like, there was no issues whatsoever. We got our tickets. We checked our luggage. We were all set to go. We were heading our way towards security when we realized Mom wasn't with us. See, my mom occasionally has to travel for work. She's a nurse practitioner. They got to do a lot of training, and sometimes that means she's got to travel to various places to keep her accreditations up. And that also means that occasionally, sometimes flights get canceled. When you get a flight canceled, you get a flight voucher. And so my mom was thinking she was going to be able to use that flight voucher to take her family to Disney, and so she would only have to pay for 9 plane tickets instead of 10. The way that plane ticket prices are now, you're talking about savings of like $1,000. It's crazy. Mom failed to notice, though, was her flight voucher that she had planned to use to go with her family to Disney had expired a month before. Yeah. And so she was very frantically trying to get it to where she could be on the same plane as the rest of us. And the rest of us were really hoping that Mom was going to be able to be on that plane because, again, Mom's the one who did all the work, which meant Mom's name was on everything, not ours. And so if we can't go to Disney, ain't one of us going on Disney. So for about 45 of the most intensely panic-induced, anxiety-riddled moments, because we are at the airport, we've got my 2 who are 7, my brother's got his 2 who are 7 and 6. You want to tell a 7-year-old that, hey, you got to the airport, but you can't go to Disney? But after 45 minutes of getting it all worked out, we finally got everything situated. Mom was going to be on the same flight as us. She was not going to be seated near us, but she was at least going to be on the same plane. And so we'd all get there at the same time. The plan was back on. Or so we thought. Because, spoiler alert, the plan was not back on. We got off the plane and we went to the shuttles that Disney have there that take you directly to your resort. It's kind of nice. You get off the plane, you get on a bus, you get to your resort. You don't have to do anything. You don't even have to grab your luggage because Disney does that for you. I wish more places. But you don't have to do anything. So we got on the bus and we're headed towards the resort. We finally get to the resort And again, our plan is then threatened of being imploded on us. See, somehow there was a mix-up. I don't know exactly where this mix-up took place, but our rooms were all kinds of crazy. For some reason, we had 3 rooms reserved, and for some reason those room breakdowns were something along the lines of Mandy, my brother and his wife, and my father were in one room. As a cruel twist, I got put in the room with my 2 daughters and my niece, Hallie. No, thank you. And my mom got saddled with my nephew, Wes, in the last room. We're not really sure what took place here. And under normal circumstances, if this were a hotel, this is no real big deal. You just swap key cards and everything's fine. You divvy them how you want them to be done, and you're all good. But at Disney, that's not the way things work. Rooms were anywhere near each other, because when you're trying to take 10 people to Disney and you're trying to book 3 different rooms, there is no chance whatsoever you're going to get rooms together. Right? You might get 2 rooms put together, that's it. So in our case, we were scattered all over that resort. And because we were assigned certain rooms, that meant that our luggage went to certain rooms, which meant if we ever got into our rooms, our stuff would not be there. Or at least not the right stuff was going to be there. And so mom is working with the lady who's there, the hostess at the place, and she's trying to get it all figured out and get it resorted and get this mess. And she's already kind of tired and frazzled, right? When you go on a plane, you got to get there super early, and you're already tired. And she'd had a frantic 45 minutes at the airport, a very stressful morning for her already. And now we're having to deal with another problem. The plan for us was that after we got into our rooms, we were going to drop off our stuff. We were going to go into the park and maybe do a ride or 2 before we had our dinner reservations. That was the plan. But now with this whole situation, that plan is going to have to shift again. And so the hostess that's there, who's doing her very best to make sure that the whole situation is resolved, she just finally tells her, like, look, we figured out how you want the rooms arranged. Why don't you take your wristbands and you guys go into the park while we get the rest of this stuff sorted out, and then you can come back into your rooms. I think they had her put our carry-on luggage into like a secured area or something like that. So we could go and do this while they sorted out the last of the details. And so even though we're still kind of stressed out and everybody's getting tired and everybody's getting frazzled, we decide, okay, let's go into the park. Let's let them get this figured out. And so we head into the park, and we've got our wristbands on and everything, and we go to scan in your wristbands to get into the park, and none of them work. Here's the thing. When you're at Disney, your wristband is everything. You can't get into the park if your wristband doesn't work. You can't eat your food if your wristband doesn't work. You can't do anything if your wristbands don't work, and none of our wristbands worked. Fun fact about my mother. When my mother gets irritated, everybody knows it. There was not once, there was multiple times that my mother was told by a referee at my brother's basketball game, if you don't knock it off, I'm going to throw you out of here, ma'am. And so we get back onto the shuttle to go back to the resort to try to get this new problem that's blown our plans up figured out, and my mom is out for blood. She spent a lot of money to send her family to Disney, and right now the plan is blowing up in our faces. And so she is about to take this nice young hostess and rip her head completely off of her body. Here's the thing. My family didn't have a lot of experience with Disney. The only other time I'd been to Disney World, I was 5. My brother was 3. I slept a little bit since then. So we didn't know how Disney operates. My wife, on the other hand, had been to both Disney World and Disneyland. She had far and away more experience with Disney. I think you went to Disneyland when you were in high school, right?
No, I was a kid, went to Disney World a lot.
Okay, so they went to Disney World a lot, I guess. I probably should have asked her that before I got up here, but whatever. And so Mandy had some experience with Disney, so she understood the way that this works. And she understood they take that motto, the happiest place on earth, very seriously. And so even though my mother was ready to murder a young woman, my wife pulled her aside and said, hey, I get it. Things aren't going according to plan right now. But this is going to work out in our favor. This is going to wind up being better than what we had planned. I think my mom rolled her eyes at her at the moment. But as is the case so often in my life, Mandy was right. Yeah, take your moment, I guess, yeah. She was right, because when we finally got everything situated, after we got everything all settled, even though we were all tired, even though we were all exhausted, and even though my children looked like this, I miss those two. Even though we were all exhausted, it actually ended up being for our benefit that things went the way that they went. Because Disney, once they got the room situated the right way, when we walked into our room, there were these giant gift baskets for each one of our children, filled with snacks and candy and activities and toys to try to help make them feel better. We got upgraded because our plan included 3 fast passes per person a day. We got upgraded to 7. In an actual line the entire time we were at Disney. And our meal plan got loaded with so many more snacks than anybody could ever eat, to the point that when we got back on the planes, headed back towards home, my carry-on backpack was literally just a book and snacks. It was a lot of fun to explain to the TSA agent, I'm going to tell you that. He's like, "How old are you?" I said, "Shut up, I went to Disney." Anyway. But while our plan was good, it didn't happen the way that we wanted it to. It actually wound up being better. We just had to get through some rough patches. That's oftentimes the case in our life, isn't it? See, we make these big and these grandiose and these amazing plans for our life that we think are so perfect and so simple and so beautiful. And then it doesn't happen the way that we planned. I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of times in my life where I have made a great plan only to watch it blow up in my face. Only to see as something takes place that just completely disrupts and destroys the plan that I had. It's infuriating. It is discouraging. Sometimes it's depressing to see as a plan that we thought was great crumble and fall right in front of us. But as I've thought back in my life, and as I've thought back to those times where everything collapsed around me, and I've had those moments in my life where just literally everything fell apart and I just could do nothing but sit there and watch, I've noticed afterwards, the plan that I did not have ends up being better than the plan that I made for myself. It never feels that way in the moment, right? Sometimes it takes years for me to realize, oh, hey, even though that happened, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And in fact, I'm in a better position in my life. I'm in a better place in my life because that plan fell apart. You got to wait for the dust to settle, for the smoke to clear, to finally see, hey, you know what? Yeah, that plan fell apart, and yeah, that hurt in that moment, but it actually ended up being a little bit better for me. It didn't feel like it in the moment, though. And I'm sure for Peter, as he saw his plan, that his idea that he thought was so good fall apart in front of him, it probably really didn't feel very good in our text today. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 23. So if you got your Bible, go ahead and go there. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 23. As you're turning there, let me get you caught up, just in case you've missed a part of where we're at. Peter has been following Jesus for a while now. He has been around for everything that Jesus has done. He has seen it all. He has heard everything that Jesus has to say. Every miracle, every parable, every sermon, every healing. Peter has had a front row seat, and it has taken his life in a direction he never thought it would be. He never thought until that day of that random encounter of Jesus getting on the boat with him, he didn't realize that that moment was going to change everything. And he has watched as Jesus has done all of these incredible things to the point that where we were last week when Jesus was literally walking on the water and he invites Peter to come out there with him, and he does. I mean, for a moment. But man, what a moment. Peter has seen as Jesus has done all of these incredible things, and you got to think that in Peter's brain he is thinking all the time that there is something different about this Jesus, that he is unlike anyone else in the entire world. But Peter can't be the only one who thinks that way, right? You got to imagine that whenever the 12 are kind of off by themselves, or whenever Jesus is maybe doing something over here, or he's off praying like he does so often, that maybe the 12 of them are kind of just getting around like, man, can you believe he did that? Could you believe he said that to the Pharisees? Wow. What's up with this dude? They're all kind of reaching the same conclusion of who this Jesus really is, but they're a little afraid to vocalize it. They're not quite ready to say it out loud yet. But one day as they're walking and they're in Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asks them a question. And it's kind of a fun question to really think about, right? Jesus has gained quite a bit of notoriety. Turns out when you can do things like turn water to wine, heal the blind, and raise the dead, people talk about you. Who knew? And a lot of the people that are in that area, they believe that Jesus is a good guy, but the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're starting to think that, well, there's something really wrong with this Jesus guy. But Jesus wants to kind of take the temperature. He wants to read the room. He wants to find out, what are people saying about me? He wants the scuttlebutt, if you want to use a fun word from an olden time that I'm trying to bring back into the lingo. In verse 13, Jesus asked his disciples a question. He says, now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, see, I told you that's where they were, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? This isn't the first time the disciples have heard Jesus say the phrase Son of Man, and so they were able to recognize right away that Jesus is actually talking about himself. Right? Jesus wants to know, what's everybody saying about me? Who are people saying that I am? Because the disciples are probably going to have better knowledge than Jesus himself, right? I don't think too many people are going to talk about it with Jesus directly to him, right? It'd be kind of weird. And so Jesus is asking these guys, who are the people saying that I am? And if we look at the answers that the disciples give, you might say at first glance that they're kind of wild. Right? They're a little all over the map, it feels like. But when we really stop to think about it for just a moment, they actually make a lot of sense as to why the people would say these answers. Chapter 14. Or excuse me, verse 14. It says this, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And again, we might look at those names and we might think those are kind of wild to throw out there. I mean, John the Baptist makes at least a little bit of sense to us, right? We know that John recently passed away, that he was beheaded by King Herod. But John and Jesus kind of came into the public conscious about the same time. John was a few years ahead of Jesus, but not too far. And their messages were roughly the same. If you go back and you read to see what the message of John the Baptist was, his message was, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near. Sound familiar? And so it at least makes some sense that people would kind of confuse Jesus and John the Baptist, right? They're kind of along the same lines. They're kind of a lot of the same person, really. But Elijah? Jeremiah? Those dudes have been dead for a real long time. Why in the world would they think that Jesus is one of these guys? Did you know there's about a 400-year gap between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew? A 400-year gap where it seemed as though God was silent. Word. There had been no voice in the desert. There had been no word from God. And in that 400-year span, some pretty terrible things have happened in the nation of Israel. Rome has run roughshod over the world, not just Israel. The Roman army has walked in, and every place they've gone, they said, this is ours now, and there wasn't anything people could do about it. So if you're a first century Jew, your life is kind of rough. So maybe after 400 years, you're just hoping to hear something, to get some kind of prophetic word, if for no other reason than to let you know God has not forgotten you. So even though it may seem kind of wild that they throw out these prophets' name, it does make some sense that something about Jesus reminds them, harkens them back to those times when they got to hear by a prophet. But Jesus isn't done yet. In fact, Jesus isn't quite ready to move on from this subject entirely. He actually wants to turn the question on its head. He asked them in verse 15, he says to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Right? He's learned what the crowds have to say about him. What about the people who are with him every day? What about the people who have been alongside of Jesus this entire time? And by now you know this about me, that my brain loves to kind of illustrate how things go, right? Like it's like a movie in my head as I read these sorts of things. And so I kind of picture all 12 of the disciples, they know who Jesus is. Okay, maybe not Judas, but they all have their suspicions as to who Jesus is. But they're still nervous. And so maybe they're all just kind of like immediately at their feet, very curious to see what their toenails look like at the moment. And they're kind of nervously looking around at each other and wondering, is anybody going to say it? Because they're scared. Understand, Jesus is not the first person that people have thought of as the Christ. Not by a long shot. There have been a lot of other supposed messiahs before this. But everybody who thought, hey, so-and-so is the Messiah, has been proven wrong. And so while the disciples may think and suspect and believe even that Jesus is the Messiah, nobody wants to say it out loud except for one of them. And there's a reason why this series is entitled Peter and not Bartholomew. Because Peter chimes in verse 16. Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Understand what a huge moment this is. Peter is not the first person to believe that Jesus is the Christ. There have been demons that Jesus has driven out that have called him such. There have been people who were in the know, like Mary, and John knew that Jesus was the Christ. But Peter is the first person to come from the outside and say that out loud. This is the first time that somebody who does not have any prior knowledge is willing to say out loud, Jesus is the Christ. We give Peter a whole lot of grief in this series, and we're not done giving him grief just yet for some of the things that come out of Peter's mouth. It's one of the reasons why I think I relate so much to Peter, is because he says some pretty dumb stuff. And I've been known to say some dumb stuff myself. But man, this is one of those moments where Peter is just outstanding. He has hit the nail directly on the head, and you can almost see the expression in Jesus' face change as he suddenly has this super big smile on his face as he tells Peter what we read in verses 17 through 19. He says this, "And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." What a beautiful moment. Right? Just a fantastic moment between Peter and Jesus two friends sharing this moment together, a teacher sharing this moment with his student, a master sharing it with his disciple. Peter is just elated over the fact that Jesus has just confirmed what he has said out loud. None of the other 11 were willing to say it out loud, but Jesus is so thrilled with Peter. This is such a great moment, maybe one of the best moments of Peter's entire life. And oh man, I wish we could leave it here. I would love if we could stop it right here in this great moment where Peter is just such a fantastic person and feeling great about himself, but unfortunately, he's about to put that foot right back. See, because after Jesus says all this, he tells the disciples, hey, you guys know that I'm the Christ now, but don't tell anybody else, right? Keep it on the down low, which is kind of weird, but okay, sure. But then his whole conversation with the disciples begins to take a turn. And it's kind of a dark one. It says in verse 21, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And on the third day be raised. You know what Jesus is talking about here. I know what Jesus is about here. And you would think with the hundreds of messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, many of which including the notion that the Christ must suffer and die, you would think that the disciples should know what Jesus is talking about here. But based on Peter's reaction in verse 22, he doesn't. It says, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Rebuke is a fun word. If you're not familiar with what a rebuke is, you've definitely had it happen in your life. You just didn't know what the word was. A rebuke is a correction. It is somebody who is correcting another individual, but usually radically. You might think of this as the voice that your father used to give that just you immediately knew you were in trouble. Right? It's the dad voice correction. Hey, knock that off. Right? Peter is rebuking Jesus. What a dork. Because this whole thing is backwards. This is not what should be happening. Peter is rebuking Jesus because Jesus is telling him what the plan is. And so the question becomes, why? Why is Peter rebuking Jesus? Why is he telling him that this thing that's been the plan, that's been talked about even in the Old Testament, why is Peter saying that this isn't going to happen? And to understand why, we need to remember two different things. And the first one is where we are in history. And the second thing is we need to know a little bit of our Old Testament Israel history. Right? Again, we are in first century Israel, and first century Israel is living under the cloak of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was great, provided you were Roman. If you were part of the myriad of other nations that Rome had conquered along their way, life was pretty rough. Everything was made more difficult because of Roman rule. You were taxed beyond your ability to be able to sustain a living for yourselves. You had to find other ways to try to eke out some sort of a living for you and your family. You were constantly oppressed by what Rome was doing. It was difficult. And if you remember your history of Israel, it kind of feels like we're in the book of Judges. If you haven't done so in a while, I challenge you sometime this week, go back and read the book of Judges. Because here's what typically happened in the book of Judges. The Israelites would do something that would incite the rage of God. They would sin against God in such a way and over such a period of time that God would finally feel the need to intervene. And God's intervention was usually to send another nation or a people group to come and oppress the Israelites, to ensnare them, to force them into labor, to do all sorts of horrible and nasty things to them, until finally the Israelites remembered, we need to call out to God. We need to repent of what we've done and ask Him to deliver us. And when they would do that, then God would raise up a judge, somebody like Samson or Gideon, who would come and they would wipe out the enemy and restore the nation of Israel unto themselves for a while. Because you can wash, rinse, and repeat that one over and over again. I consider Judges to be one of the most depressing books of the Old Testament, not because it's not interesting to read, but because the nation of Israel keeps the same stupid things. And so the Israelites of the first century Roman Empire are trying their best to plead to God to deliver a conquering hero. And so the commonly held belief among them is that the Christ is going to be the one. He's going to be a military leader who is going to rise up and run Rome right out of Israel here and restore the nation to us, because that is who the Christ is going to be. And so when Peter said, "You are the Christ," this is what he's talking about. And so when he rebukes Jesus for saying that the Christ is going to suffer and die, it's because what military hero dies before they can overtake the enemy? So he's telling Jesus this can't. And given everything that we've talked about with Peter today, given his response about who Jesus is, and given Jesus' response to Peter proclaiming him to be the Christ, there is no chance whatsoever that verse 23 did not feel like a gut punch to Peter. There is no way that verse 23 felt any slap across the face. But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Ooh. Get behind me, Satan? It doesn't get a whole lot more emphatic than that, does it? Understand, all Peter was doing in this moment is he's trying to salvage what he believed the Christ to be. And it sounds like what Jesus has to say is so very harsh, and I am certain in the moment it felt real harsh. But I don't think that Jesus meant it to be harsh. See, Peter had a plan. He had a plan for what the Christ was supposed to be, the conquering hero, come to save the Israelites from Roman Empire. And Jesus is letting him know that's not the plan. Peter had a really good idea of what the plan ought to be. It made sense to him. It was perfect. It was the way that God had functioned in the past. And it was the way that God had always participated with the Israelites, who are still known as God's chosen people. This was going to bring mercy to thousands, if not millions, of people. This is a good plan. Plan that Jesus came to fulfill. See, Peter's plan was meant to benefit himself and the Jews of that time. Jesus' plan was meant to benefit the entire world for all time. Peter's plan was a very short-term thing. Jesus' plan was for eternity. Peter's plan was good and for the good of a comparative few. Jesus' plan is for the good of all. So often in our lives, the plans that we make feel like the right ones. Don't they? I don't know how you come about plans in your own life. I like to think through plans. I like to imagine every scenario where, what if this happens or what if that goes on? But inevitably, I overlook something. Or I don't think about something happening along my plan, and that plan falls down like a house of cards. And it feels irritating at best. It's heartbreaking at worst. And let's be honest. Can we do that? We're in church, right? We're supposed to tell the truth, right? Very rarely does God's plan make any sense. Very rarely does God's plan for my life feel like it makes any sense to me. Peter's plan probably felt like it made a lot of sense. We're going to be liberated. We're going to this evil Roman Empire. We're going to be the ones who rise up against them and take them out, and it's going to save so many people. But the idea that the Christ would suffer and die? That doesn't make any sense. What if Peter got his way? You ever thought about that before? Did was rise up as a military leader and lead the Israelites to overthrow the Roman Empire and kick them out of Israel. Well, it'd be a fun story in history for sure. It might have sped up the end of the Roman Empire, right? To see this really small nation essentially rise up against them and wipe them out. It could have been a fun footnote in history. But that's about all it would be. See, we know from further down the mission of the Israelites was not done. We're in 2025, and I'm not sure it's done yet. So everything would have been great, but it would have only been great for a moment. The Israelites would fall back under oppression of some kind. You and I, as Gentiles, would have absolutely no reason to be here altogether. And worst of all, sin would remain unconquered. We would still have no pathway back to God. God had a better plan. Peter just couldn't see it in the moment. It is insanely difficult for us when our fall by the wayside. And please, in no way, shape, or form am I trying to minimize anyone's pain from having your plans destroyed. Again, it can be rather heartbreaking for that to happen to us. And I am in no way trying to minimize that or mock that in any way, shape, or form. I know that pain. I know the pain of man, we're going to do this, we're going to go here, we're going to make that happen, and then that person passes away, who all those plans hinged on. Or they get sick and they don't recover. Or we have this plan of, I'm going to invest this money over here and it's going to be great, and I'm going to create such a better life for my family, not just for now, but for generations. And then that stock falls. And we lose everything. Or we have this plan of, this person and I are going to build an amazing life together. And then that person bails. In no way, shape, or form am I trying to minimize all of that. And believe me, it is so hard for me to say this and mean it. God's plan is better. I know that seems Wow, a pastor tells me that God's plan is better? Woo! It sounds so cliched. I get that. But it is. It won't feel like it in the moment. It probably won't feel like it for a long time. You may not be around to see that plan fulfilled. But God's plan is better. You and I have to do the hardest thing for us to do. We have to trust in somebody and something other than ourselves. Our prayer as the followers of Jesus should not be, God bless my plans. Our prayer needs to be, God help me to trust in yours. And then, who knows? Maybe the next time our plan falls apart, we'll rejoice because God's got something better. Proverbs 16 verse 9 says this, and we will close with it today. It says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps.